You know, it's almost impossible to go a day without hearing about some new AI breakthrough.
Oh, absolutely. Every day is something new.
And like more often than not, at the heart of it all is this thing called a transformer model.
Hmm.
From understanding what you're saying to generating, incredibly realistic images, even tackling complex stuff in biology, they seem to be everywhere.
They really are.
And if you're anything like me, you're constantly trying to keep up, but without getting completely lost in all the technical jargon.
Absolutely. The pace is just,
Yeah.
well, it's staggering. And for anyone looking to quickly but, thoroughly understand this key technology, it can feel like a bit of an uphill battle.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, we're going straight to the core, the transformer model itself. We've waded through quite a stack of sources, blog posts, research papers from places like ArcFIF, articles from Take
The
Resources.
usual suspects.
Right. To bring you the essential insights, our mission today is basically to unpack what makes these transformer models so incredibly powerful and versatile, even if some of the ideas behind them might seem, well, a little abstract at first glance.
And understanding the transformer is truly key because, as our sources really emphasize, these models are totally central to how large language models, LLMs, work so efficiently.
Right.
They're what allows these huge AI systems to process information with better accuracy, train faster on these massive data sets,
Yeah.
and be applied to just a much wider range of problems than we could before.
Okay.
And it's also really crucial to recognize, as you hinted, that not all transformer models are created equal. There are different types designed for different jobs.
Okay, let's unpack this then. So, our sources tell us there are a few common ways people categorize these transformer models. We see mentions of like mass language models, autoregressive models, and conditional transformers.
Hmm.
But to really get a handle on it, it feels like looking at their architecture, how they're actually built, gives us a maybe clearer picture.
That's a really good way to put it. Architecturally, yeah, we can broadly classify them based on whether they primarily use the encoder part, the decoder part, or maybe both. Let's start with the encoder-only transformers.
So, encoder only, the name kind of gives it away, doesn't it? These models just use the encoder section of the transformer.
That's it.
The focus here is really on understanding the input sequence, right? Getting the meaning. Generating a new sequence of words isn't really their main goal.
Precisely. And the source material highlights that these encoder-only models are often what we call masked language models, or MLMs.
Ah, MLMs.
Yeah, and the way they learn is quite fascinating, actually. They're trained to predict a missing or masked word in a sentence just by looking at all the words around it, both before and after.
Okay.
And this forces the model to develop a really deep understanding of how words relate to each other within that specific context.
Ah, so it's not just predicting the next word, it's understanding the whole sentence structure around the gap.
Exactly. Which leads to a crucial advantage. The benefit of this MLM approach, this masked language modeling, is that they can be pre-trained on absolutely massive amounts of text data.
Right.
And this lets them build a really, really strong foundation in understanding language context and the relationships between words.
Okay, so they learn the rules of language,
Hmm.
sort of, before tackling specific tasks.
You got it. And because they have this deep understanding baked in, they become incredibly useful for a whole range of downstream natural language processing, or NLP tasks.
That makes sense. This pre-trained knowledge acts as a fantastic starting point.
It really does. Now, before the model can even start processing text, there's a really crucial step called tokenization.
Tokenization, yeah, we hear that term thrown around a lot.
Hmm.
It's basically just breaking down a chunk of text into smaller pieces, the tokens, right? These tokens are what the model actually works with.
Mm.
And one of our sources mentioned something called subword tokenization, like word pieces. What's the advantage there?
Ah, good question. Subword tokenization is actually a pretty clever way to handle words the model hasn't seen during training, or just really rare words.
Okay.
Instead of treating an entire unknown word as just one single mysterious unknown token, it breaks it down into smaller, more frequent subunits that it has seen.
Like breaking down transformer into transform and error,
Yeah,
something like that.
sort of, yeah.
Mhm.
Or maybe even smaller pieces, depending on the vocabulary.
Hmm,
This helps manage the size of the model's vocabulary and makes processing new or rare words much more efficient.
that does make sense. But our sources also point out that tokenization isn't perfect, right? It has downsides.
Definitely.
It can be language dependent, meaning the way you break down text in English might not work so well for, say, Chinese or Japanese.
Exactly. Different languages have very different structures. There's also the potential for some information, some nuance maybe, to get lost in that breaking down process.
Hmm.
And of course, it adds some computational overhead. It's another step in the pipeline.
Yeah, these are important limitations to keep in mind. I think our sources even mentioned something called byte-level inputs as an alternative.
That's right. Some research explores using byte-level inputs, which basically skips tokenization altogether by having the model work directly with the raw bytes of the text.
Interesting. Okay, so with this idea of how text gets prepped for the model, let's circle back to how these tokens are actually used within those really powerful large language models. How do transformers fit into the whole LLM picture?
Right, so LLMs, as our sources explain, are essentially deep learning models. And they're very often built using these transformer architectures we're talking about, but just with a huge number of layers, like many, many layers stacked up.
Okay, so large refers to the depth and number of parameters.
Precisely. And this depth allows them to learn incredibly complex linguistic patterns from these vast, vast amounts of text data they're trained on.
And because they've learned all these intricate patterns, they get this amazing ability to generate text that sounds really coherent and relevant to the context. We're talking about things like writing articles, translating languages, summarizing long documents, answering all sorts of questions.
All those tasks that make them incredibly valuable tools, yeah.
Absolutely. However, one of the big challenges that gets highlighted is the high overhead involved in fine-tuning these massive models for specific tasks.
Oh, definitely. Fine-tuning is a big one.
Because they have so many parameters, right? The memory requirements are just substantial.
Huge.
And retraining them with new information or trying to edit specific facts they know, that sounds really difficult and computationally expensive.
It really is. It's not like you can just quickly update a database entry.
It's more like trying to rewrite a single sentence in a library that contains millions and millions of books.
That's a great analogy. And our source material does touch on some workarounds, things like specific model editing techniques or adding smaller sets of learnable weights, sometimes called adapters, to sort of inject new knowledge without having to go through the whole costly retraining process.
Adapters, okay. That sounds more manageable.
It can be. And then there are also challenges when we actually use these LLMs, what we call inference, just getting them to generate an answer.
Right, not training, but using them day to day.
Exactly. Our sources point out that the way many LLMs generate text, often one token at a time, makes it inherently difficult to process things in parallel.
Ah, so it's sequential.
It often is, which slows things down. Plus, just the sheer size of the model itself and all the temporary data it needs while it's generating text, like those attention scores we'll get to, it means that it has a really significant memory footprint.
Okay, so they're powerful but resource hungry, both in training and in use.
That's a fair summary.
So despite these hurdles, in fine-tuning and inference, the sheer ability of these LLMs to create text that feels, well, human-like is what's truly captivating everyone, isn't it?
Absolutely.
They've analyzed so much data that they can interact with us in these incredibly sophisticated ways. I mean, ChatGPT is the prime example everyone knows, right? That conversational ability is built right on these LLM foundations.
It really is.
Yeah.
And the sources emphasize the different ways people can tap into this power, from easily integrating their capabilities into apps, using APIs like from OpenAI or others,
Right, just plugging it in.
to using open source versions of these models, which is becoming more common. And even, for the really ambitious folks, building one from scratch. So that's a major undertaking.
For sure. Now, as impressive as all this generative power is, our sources also bring up a really crucial point. The black box problem.
Ah, yes, interpretability,
Oh.
or the lack thereof.
Exactly. These transformer models, especially the really, really big ones, can be incredibly difficult to understand internally. It's like we can see what goes in and we see what comes out, but the actual step-by-step reasoning inside, it's often a mystery.
That's a very apt analogy. The complexity, all those multiple layers of neural networks and that self-attention mechanism we keep mentioning, it just makes it really hard to pinpoint why a model made a particular prediction or generated a certain phrase.
And this lack of transparency raises concerns, right? About accountability, fairness, even things like copyright, if the model generates something that looks like existing work.
Absolutely. These are major ongoing discussions in the field.
And the sheer scale of these models also leads directly to another important issue we touched on, computational efficiency and their carbon footprint.
Right. The environmental impact.
Bigger models generally perform better, seem more accurate, But they also require vastly more computing power,
Hmm.
which translates directly to higher energy consumption during training and sometimes inference, too.
Absolutely. Our sources definitely acknowledge that this energy intensity contributes significantly to the overall carbon footprint of AI development and deployment. It's a real concern.
But there's work being done there.
Oh, yes. Thankfully, there's a lot of ongoing research focused on developing more efficient transformer architectures. People are exploring techniques like sparse attention.
Sparse attention.
Yeah, instead of every word attending to every other word, maybe it only needs to attend to a few key ones. That reduces the computational load. Also, things like low-rank approximations for the attention matrices. Ways to make the math less intensive.
Okay, so trying to make them leaner and meaner.
Pretty much. And it's encouraging to see our sources even mention some completely alternative architectures like Mamba and RWKV that are specifically designed to try and address these computational bottlenecks, especially when you're dealing with really long sequences of data.
Mamba and RWKV. New names to me.
Yeah, they're getting traction.
Yeah.
Mamba, for instance, is noted for scaling linearly with sequence length, which is a huge improvement over the quadratic scaling of standard transformers. And RWKV tries to blend the strengths of transformers with older ideas from recurrent neural networks, using linear attention.
So innovation isn't just about making transformers bigger, it's also about making them smarter and more efficient.
Exactly. That's a huge thrust of current research. And related to that is another key area, improving how models handle context, especially for very long sequences.
Right, because sometimes you need the model to remember something from way back at the beginning of a long document.
Precisely. New models are being designed to better utilize the information within their context window, the amount of text they can look at simultaneously, without losing track of important details from earlier on. This is crucial for tasks like summarizing lengthy reports or answering complex questions that require synthesizing information from across a large document.
Okay, this is all fascinating, but I feel like to really grasp the power of transformers, we need to maybe dive a bit deeper into that architecture you mentioned. Use an analogy earlier about a team of experts.
Ah, yes, the expert team
Yeah,
analogy.
can you elaborate on that? Help us sort of visualize what's going on inside the black box.
Certainly, let's try.
Yeah.
Imagine you have a document, maybe a complex report, and you need to understand it really deeply. Instead of just one person reading it front to back,
Mm-hmm.
you assemble a team of experts. Each expert, let's say, has a different specialty. One looks for cause and effect relationships, another tracks who did what, a third focuses on the timeline, and so on. In a transformer model, those experts are kind of like the attention heads.
Attention heads. Got it.
Each head looks at the input sequence, the sentence or paragraph, and tries to figure out how different words relate to each other based on its specific focus.
So they're all analyzing the same text, but looking for different connections.
Exactly. Then they sort of share their insights, maybe write little notes connecting words, and this whole process, analyzing relationships, sharing insights, gets repeated across multiple layers in the model. Each layer builds on the understanding of the previous one, allowing the model to construct a really rich, multifaceted understanding of the text.
Okay, I like that analogy. It makes it feel less like magic and more like a structured process. So what are the key components, the actual machinery that make this happen?
Right, let's break it down. At a high level, there are several crucial parts. First, you have input encoding.
Encoding. Getting the words into numbers the computer can use.
Exactly. This is where the words, or more likely the tokens we discussed, are transformed into numerical representations. We call these embeddings.
Embeddings. Okay.
And importantly, this stage also needs to incorporate information about the position of each word in the sequence, so the model understands the order.
Right, because the dog bites the man means something very different from the man bites the dog. The order is critical.
Critical, exactly. So positional information gets added to the word embeddings. Then we have the transformer blocks. These are the core processing units. And a typical transformer model will have many of these blocks stacked on top of each other, like floors in a building.
Okay, stackable blocks.
Inside each block, the first really key mechanism is self-attention.
Self-attention. Okay, this is the magic ingredient everyone talks about, isn't it? This sounds like the core of it.
Yeah.
How does that work in simple terms?
It really is the core innovation. In simplified terms, self-attention allows the model, when it's processing each individual word, to weigh the importance of all the other words in the input sequence relative to that word.
Okay. Weigh the important.
Think of it like this. If the model is trying to understand the word it in a sentence like, the chicken didn't cross the road because it was too tired,
Right.
self-attention allows the model to look back at the other words chicken, road, and figure out that it most likely refers to chicken, not road. It learns that connection has a higher weight.
Ah, I see. So it's about the words in the sentence directly relating to each other dynamically to figure out the context for each word.
Precisely. It lets the model build these contextual understandings on the fly. Now, the actual mechanism involves some math with things called queries, keys, and values.
Okay, maybe let's not get lost in the matrix multiplication.
Right. Let's skip the deep math. Think of queries as representing the current word asking a question, like, who relates to me? Keys are like labels on all the other words saying, here's what I'm about. And values are the actual substance or meaning of those other words. Self-attention is a mechanism to find which keys best match the query and then combine the corresponding values based on those matches.
So it's like a sophisticated lookup system where each word queries the others to find relevant information.
That's a great way to think about it. The crucial outcome is that the model learns which words are most relevant to understanding each other word in that specific context.
Got it. So the words are all kind of talking to each other, figuring out who's important to whom in this particular sentence. That's powerful. What comes next in the transformer block after self-attention?
Right. After the self-attention layer calculates these contextualized representations, the information often goes through multi-head attention.
Multi-head, like more than one expert.
Exactly like that. It's essentially running that self-attention process multiple times in parallel with different sets of learned queries, keys, and values. These are the multiple heads, or experts.
Ah, so back to the expert team analogy.
Precisely. Each head can learn to focus on different kinds of relationships simultaneously. Maybe one head gets good at tracking subject-verb agreement, another focuses on pronoun references, another looks at semantic similarity.
Okay, so having multiple experts, multiple heads, gives the model a more comprehensive, well-rounded understanding.
That's the idea. It captures different facets of the relationships in the text. Then, the outputs from all these heads are combined and passed on to the next sublayer, which is usually a feed-forward network.
Feed-forward network, just a standard neural network layer.
Pretty much. It's typically a simple, fully connected network applied independently to each position. It does further processing on the information learned by the attention mechanisms, sort of consolidating the insights. Within the block, we also typically have layer normalization. Think of this as a technique to keep the numbers flowing through the network stable, preventing them from getting too large or too small, which helps the training process converge better and faster.
Like keeping things balanced.
Exactly. And another really important component is residual connections, sometimes called skip connections.
Residual connection.
Yeah, these are like little express lanes. They allow the original input to a sublayer, like self-attention or the feed-forward network, to be added directly to its output.
So it skips over the processing. Why?
It helps with training very deep networks. It ensures that information from earlier layers can flow more easily through the network without getting lost or mangled by too many transformations. It combats the vanishing gradient problem.
Ah, okay, so it helps information persist through the layers.
Right. And finally, particularly in models designed to generate text, there's usually a language model head at the very end, after all the transformer blocks. This is often a final linear layer followed by a softmax function, which takes the final processed representation and predicts the probability of the next word or token in the sequence.
Okay, wow, that gives us a much clearer picture of the internal machinery. Input encoding, transformer blocks with self-attention, multi-head attention, feed-forward networks, plus normalization and residual connections, and sometimes a final prediction head.
That's the core architecture in a nutshell.
Great. Now, going back to the different types of transformer models based on how they use this architecture, we talked about encoder-only models like BERT, good for understanding input.
Right.
What about the others? You mentioned decoder-only.
Yes, decoder-only models. These models, famously like the GPT series from OpenAI, primarily use just the decoder part of the transformer architecture. Their main job is text generation.
Okay, so they're built for creating text.
Exactly. They work by predicting the next token in a sequence based on all the tokens that came before it. To do this, they use a special kind of self-attention called masked self-attention.
Masked. How is that different?
The masking prevents the model, when predicting the token at a certain position, from looking ahead at the tokens that come later in the sequence. It can only attend to the words it has already generated or seen up to that point.
That makes sense. Otherwise, it would be cheating. It would already know the answer it's supposed to predict.
Precisely. It enforces that autoregressive, predict the next word behavior.
So they're essentially reading what they've generated so far to figure out what word makes sense to put next. And then the third type, encoder-decoder models.
Exactly. These models, like the original transformer paper proposed, and later models like the T5 series, use both the encoder and the decoder stacks.
The whole thing.
The whole shebang. They're really well suited for tasks where you have an input sequence that needs to be transformed into a different output sequence. The classic example is machine translation.
Like English to French.
Perfect example. The encoder reads and understands the input English sentence, creating a rich representation. Then, the decoder takes that representation and generates the corresponding French sentence, token by token, using attention mechanisms to refer back to the encoder's understanding of the input as needed.
Okay, so encoder understands the source, decoder generates the target based on that understanding. That makes sense for translation, summarization maybe?
Exactly. Summarization, question answering, where the answer isn't just a span in the input. Tasks that require sequence-to-sequence transformation.
It's really amazing to see how this single core architecture, despite using different parts of it or tweaking the attention, can be adapted for such fundamentally different purposes, understanding, generation, transformation.
It's incredibly flexible.
And it's not just about language anymore, is it? Our sources were clear that these applications go way beyond just LLMs.
Oh yeah, that's a key takeaway. While LLMs have definitely, grabbed most of the headlines recently, transformer models are proving incredibly versatile across different domains.
Like that study you mentioned on toxic language identification.
Right, one of our sources specifically looked at that, comparing the performance of different encoder-only models, Roberta, Albert, and Distilbert. They train these on labeled data sets to classify text as toxic or non-toxic.
Oh, what were the interesting findings there? It sounded like Distilbert maybe being smaller, sometimes labeled fewer things as toxic.
That was one observation, yes. They also found, maybe counterintuitively, that increasing the certainty threshold requiring the model to be more confident before labeling something as toxic actually improved overall performance metrics, like the F1 score.
Interesting. Trading off some recall for better precision.
Exactly. And the study also really highlighted the inherent challenge in just defining what toxic language even means consistently. It's subjective.
Very true. And they use standard metrics, right? Precision, recall, F1.
Yes, those are crucial for evaluating classification tasks like this. But moving beyond text, our sources also note the significant rise of vision transformers, or VITs.
VITs, transformers for images.
That's right. They adapt the transformer architecture for tasks like image classification. The key idea is to break an image down into patches, treat those patches kind of like tokens.
Like words in a sentence.
Exactly. And then feed the sequence of patches through a transformer. It learns the relationships between different parts of the image.
So instead of understanding how words relate, it's understanding how, say, the patch containing an ear relates to the patch containing an eye on a picture of a cat.
You've got it. That's the core idea. It's a fascinating shift in perspective, applying this sequence processing architecture to spatial data.
Wow. And the applications don't stop there, right? Biology.
Yeah, another really exciting area is biological data analysis. Transformers are being used to analyze genomic sequences, looking for patterns, and perhaps most famously recently, in protein folding prediction. Models like AlphaFold 2, while complex, incorporate attention ideas similar to transformers.
Predicting how proteins fold, that's a huge biological problem.
Massive.
Yeah.
And transformers are proving remarkably effective there. Then you also see them popping up in robotics, maybe for planning or interpreting sensor data,
Okay.
and in audio processing too. Models like Conformer and OpenAI's Whisper use transformer-like attention mechanisms for speech recognition. They often work by processing spectrograms, visual representations of sound, almost like images.
So they turn speech into a picture and then use vision transformer techniques.
That's a common approach, yes. Treating the spectrogram frames as a sequence of tokens.
It really hammers home the fundamental power and adaptability of this self-attention concept, doesn't it? It works on text, images, biological sequences, audio.
It really does seem to be a very general and powerful mechanism for modeling sequential or structured data.
But with all this power comes responsibility, right? We need to touch on the ethical considerations. Our sources brought up several concerns.
Yes, definitely. The ethical landscape around LLMs and transformers is complex and evolving rapidly. Key issues include things like AI hallucinations.
Hallucinations. You mean the model just making stuff up?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Generating plausible sounding but factually incorrect or nonsensical information. That's a big problem, especially if people trust the output implicitly.
I can see that. What else?
Then there's information bias. Because these models learn from vast amounts of text data, often scraped from the internet, they inevitably learn and can perpetuate the biases present in that data.
So biases related to race, gender, stereotypes.
All of those, unfortunately. Mitigating bias is a huge area of research, but it's very challenging. There are also significant privacy and data security risks, depending on how the models are trained and used, especially if they process sensitive personal information.
And the black box problem we discussed feeds into this too, right? The lack of transparency and interpretability makes it hard to audit for bias or understand why it hallucinates.
Precisely. It complicates accountability. If a model makes a harmful decision, who is responsible? How do you fix it if you don't know why it happened?
Our sources also mention some specific issues in the context of medical education, which was interesting.
Yes, that was a specific focus in one article. Concerns there included potential deficiencies in developing emotional intelligence if students rely too heavily on AI, issues around educational inequities if access isn't universal, problems with academic integrity like using LLMs to cheat,
Uh-huh.
and fundamental questions about responsibility for AI-generated medical advice and even copyright of AI-assisted work.
It seems like existing legal and ethical frameworks like GDPR for privacy or EPA in healthcare might struggle to keep up.
They often do. Our sources pointed out that these frameworks have limitations when applied to complex LLMs. Different global regulations have differing values. Achieving true transparency with these incredibly complex models is technically very hard. And we often lack robust mechanisms for detecting subtle biases or assigning clear accountability.
So what's the proposed solution?
Well, particularly for high-stakes areas like medical education, the recommendation highlighted was the need for a unified, specific ethical framework tailored for LLMs in that context.
Okay, not just applying old rules, but creating new ones.
Exactly. Based on principles like ensuring quality control of the AI output, protecting privacy rigorously, demanding transparency where possible, promoting fairness and equity, upholding academic integrity, defining clear lines of accountability, protecting intellectual property, and actively promoting research into these ethical challenges.
That sounds like a sensible, though challenging, path forward.
It's definitely a work in progress for the entire field.
Okay, so to try and wrap this up, we've taken quite a deep dive today into transformer models. We've looked at their core architecture, that crucial self-attention mechanism,
The heart of it all.
the different ways they're built, like encoder-only, decoder-only, and encoder-decoder models, and their incredible versatility, popping up in language, vision, biology, audio, and more.
And we've seen that while the underlying math, can get pretty intricate, the fundamental idea allowing elements within a sequence, like words or image patches, to directly relate to each other, to understand context has proven to be a truly revolutionary concept in AI.
Absolutely. It's also clear that research and development in this field are just moving at lightning speed. People are working hard to make these models more efficient, more interpretable, and hopefully more ethically sound.
Definitely.
It really feels like not only just scratching the surface of how deeply integrated these technologies will become in our work and our daily lives.
I think that's true. The potential is immense, but so are the challenges.
Indeed. And considering this rapid progress, here's maybe a final thought for you, our listener, to ponder. Beyond the applications we already see, what are the truly unexpected ways you think transformer models might impact your specific field or just your daily life in the near future?
That's a good question to leave folks with. It's a reminder to think about both the incredible potential and, crucially, the ethical responsibilities that come hand in hand with developing and deploying such powerful technology.